Thank you for listening to this content by Alex Merced. If you would like to support the efforts of Alex Merced, head over to donate.alexmerced.com. Here you'll find options for monthly donations, one-time donations, and several offers that you can take advantage of. Your support helps Alex Merced to be able to dedicate the time, effort, and resources to create quality content like this and even more, and to continue to expand his efforts. Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmerced.com, and I just got done watching an episode of One Day at a Time that spurred a conversation that I thought was interesting. So essentially what happened in this episode of One Day at a Time, or actually over a couple different episodes, and if you don't watch the show One Day at a Time, I highly recommend that you do. It's a sitcom, so this shouldn't be too much of a spoiler. It's kind of like your standard plot line, but essentially what the show is about, it's about a Cuban family. And what happens in one episode, the son of the family is caught trying marijuana, and this very much concerns the mother. And the reason is because of the idea of sort of prejudice in the judicial system, in the sense that people who are Latino are basically treated more harshly when it comes, in this case, more particular to marijuana crimes, because of sort of historical sort of stereotypes and associations between sort of Latinos and the drug trade and all this stuff. So this spurred a conversation as, is this true? Is this something that I have experienced? I'm Guatemalan. Have I ever seen people sort of assume or think or whatnot? And then, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say like, hey, people have treated me differently or meanly, assuming that I do drugs or something like that. But when people what I definitely have noticed when people characterize sort of, I mean, not so much in the last few years as drug legalization has come, a lot of and decriminalization has come, a lot of the associations with drugs have changed. But definitely there was a period of time where basically when you would think of the supply chain of drugs, people always kind of pigeonholed African Americans as drug dealers. They would pigeonhole as Latinos as drug cartel members and gang members and drug dealers, part of the supply chain. And then it was always sort of the stereotype of the sort of that rich middle class white kid who would go down to the bad neighborhood to go buy some drugs. And then basically this discussion kind of hit me sort of the difference, why you do kind of have this sort of, which, I mean, you can look at it in a race way in the sense that it's because of race, but I think it's more the roles that we associate to different classes of people in the sense of producer versus consumer. Because it's kind of like if you take a look at other things, so like whether the specific example I used in this conversation was McDonald's and people who are overweight. So you have two people. You have the consumer and the producer. You have the person who's eaten a lot of McDonald's and gotten very overweight, and then you have McDonald's selling the food that made them overweight. Now, technically, both have agency, both have responsibility that these things happen to some extent or other. But oftentimes people are going to be much more sympathetic to the person who's eating the food and be like, oh man, that corporation McDonald's, I can't believe they're producing this food and making people unhealthy. Okay, we need to take action against McDonald's. People always have a tendency to sort of lash out at the producer. Okay, assuming that, sort of kind of giving them more responsibility, always treating the consumer as a victim of their agency. And this is kind of a lot of the reason why a lot of these same people oftentimes feel that the agency should be taken away from the consumer, and they want to regulate the market, prevent the consumer from having these choices, because they just don't think that the consumer can make the right choice. So they sort of assign the sort of role of a victim, so it gives them the benefit of the doubt. Okay, so if you apply that same kind of thinking here, when you take a look at sort of the way people view drugs for a long time, you know, if you take a look at sort of the prejudices, the sort of the stereotypes of different sort of racial classes in, you know, if you sit there and you, like, what role would you automatically assign? What would sort of be the intuition from sort of the culture you've consumed and whatnot? Honestly, you'd see this dynamic where people kind of always assume that while white people use drugs and white people get caught as drugs, they're seen more as a consumer. They're not part of the supply chain. They're not the producer. They're not the distributor. They're the consumer. So they're assigned sort of that victim role that, oh, well, if they didn't know better, it's the drug dealers and the cartels who are selling them the drugs. In the same way, it's McDonald's selling the burgers to the people who get big, or, assigned pretty much any time where someone, suffers a consequence because of something they chose to consume. People always sit there and want to lash out at the producer, the distributor, the supply chain. So to me, a lot of the racial outcomes, or at least, again, this is just something that's sort of I'm trying to think through. This is just something that kind of hit me in the last within the last hour, within the last 20 minutes, really, that to the extent that there are racial disparities in the way we think of certain things, oftentimes can maybe be tied to the way we associate certain classes of people between consumption and production of different goods and services. And that this may not necessarily tie or translate very well in other areas, but I do think when it comes to sort of why there are differences in drug sentencing, because I definitely feel that people have different impulses when it comes to the level of punishment they want on someone. But it isn't always because they're thinking in terms of racial. These aren't necessarily people who are thinking, oh man, these people are better than other people, or these people are just naturally going to know better or know worse or more likely to do bad. It's not so much that, but I do think it has something to do with sort of the associations we have with, again, consumer versus producer, and how oftentimes people have a tendency of applying more responsibility to people on the production side and taking responsibility or assuming away responsibility on the consumption side. So again, this is a new thought, but something to think through and something to consider in kind of trying to consider how social dynamics and between how this affects crime and punishment, and how people can be punished unfairly because of the associations we have and the prejudices and stereotypes that exist in society. And again, some of it can come to the way we just sort of economically think. As a libertarian, it's very easy for me to kind of see the unfairness because I'm someone who looks at generally everyone has agency and everyone has responsibility over their decisions. So whether you're the consumer or the producer, you don't have any less responsibility or more responsibility over the transactions you engage in. You did them freely. So to the extent you suffer bad consequences, or the extent you did something bad, you're no better or no worse for being the producer than the consumer. So if you're an assassin and you're hired by someone, I don't have any less sympathy for the assassin who's providing a service versus the person who paid for the service of the person who hired the assassin. They both are doing something bad. And both of them chose to engage in that transaction. But I do think culturally there is a bias against producers and a bias towards consumers that can at times transcend racial lines within certain goods and services that have become sort of very racially associated over time, oftentimes because of politics of yesteryear. I mean, the politics of drugs is very racial. A lot of the reasons why drug prohibition exists is because of racial reasons, to basically find ways to separate people because they didn't want this race or that race around them. So then these associations came to exist. And you can see the same thing about sort of other things that really shouldn't be crimes that became crimes, because oftentimes there is class conflicts. And again, it doesn't necessarily have to be racial. It could be class conflicts between different ethnicities, class regarding socioeconomic class. There's just different class conflicts, and people use, no one wants to sit there and say, hey, I want to separate the classes of people. It's just generally not a very cool thing to say. So then people try to do that sort of work around by trying to create rules that accomplish the same thing, and oftentimes sort of cross that line. So I just wanted to say that. I'll leave you off. I mean, this is the first time I'm kind of doing a lot of these sort of interject these audio pieces throughout. So I'm going to give you guys a quick ad before I go and give my final thoughts. So I'll see you guys on the other side of this, and then I'll tell you a little bit more.
This show is sponsored by Bluehost, Amazon's Audible, and NordVPN. To take advantage of their offers and products, check out libertarianbuyer.com, where you'll find those and many more sponsors of this content. Make sure to check out libertarianbuyer.com. Now, basically, again, to summarize, is what I'm trying to say is that there are racial components to how different institutions work. But what I'm saying is that it's not always just explicitly just the reason why sometimes things become racial. It's not just because people just have this innate, oh, this race good, this race bad. It's sometimes more complicated with that. It's more with the sort of assigned roles that people have associated with different races in different vectors of society. And in this case, specifically in the drug world, over time, there has been this association, oftentimes, of the visual of sort of the white, sort of middle-class consumer of drugs versus sort of the oftentimes minority-based drug dealers and drug cartels, which oftentimes there's people who are white, black, Hispanic consumers, and there's white, black, Hispanic people in the supply chain. But when you take a look at movies, when you take a look at basically all portrayals of the drug supply chain, there are these sort of connotations that in associations that build up because of that. This is why culture does matter. And again, it doesn't necessarily mean there should be intervention in the creation of culture, but it does mean, we want to create culture that creates better associations and going forward. It's something worth thinking about, worth talking about. But at the end of the day, even more at its core is this sort of bias against producers versus consumers, because people always, again, assume responsibility away from consumers. And I think that's a much more consistent relationship you can see across many sort of class battles, regardless of what the vector of class it is. Again, whether it's race, gender, socioeconomic class, whatever, a lot of it's the difference between, again, consumer and producer. So hopefully you guys found that thought-provoking. Again, I want to say this is an open and shut case. I just thought about this like 20 minutes ago, so this is just me wanting to get this out there, to get the conversation started, to see if maybe there is something to this. There is something worth discussing here. But I'll talk to you guys later. This is Alex Merced from alexmerced.com.
Thank you for listening to the Alex Merced